Every job comes with its own set of challenges, and this one was no different. The question was, how do we balance lighting and exposure in order to achieve the look that we wanted? Well, in this video, I'll walk you through every decisions that I made on set. And I may show you a few tricks along the way. Let's dive right in. The job was pretty straightforward. A series of interviews and B-roll in order to create a corporate film for our client. The first thing that I noticed when I walked into the facility was this lobby and this beautiful view. It's always a little tricky to make the decision to shoot through a window like this because you have to balance the outside light with the inside light in order to balance the shot, or else the window is going to be blown out or your subject inside is going to be way too dark. I always say you need to expose for the uncontrollable, and that means in this case exposing for the windows. I have no control of the brightness outside, so my exposure is going to be based on balancing those windows. But before I start messing with the exposure, I always have a level of ND filter on my camera. And I do it that way so that once I'm done setting up the lighting and I have the right contrast that I want, if for some reason I'm like, it's a little dark, I want to bump it up one stop, I don't have to adjust every light. I can just remove a little bit of ND filter and just raise all the levels, and all the ratios are going to stay the same. Or if maybe the sunlight start coming out, now hopefully it doesn't come through the window and it's a direct sunlight, but let's say outside becomes a little brighter, then I can add a little bit of ND filters and then just lower my levels and keep all the same ratios. So I always start with a little bit of ND on the front of my camera. I always talk about camera settings not being exposure tools, but creative tools. So I try not to use my camera settings for exposure. They're strictly to achieve the final look that I want on my picture. Let's start with aperture. We need to decide how shallow we want our depth of field. How blurry do we want this background to be? My lens is a 1.3, which means I can make this background very, very blurry. And so you have to make a decision and then you adjust your aperture to then achieve the shallow depth of field that you want. And in my case, this one was an f2. So I didn't shoot fully open, which I tend not to do during interviews because at 1.3, if that person shifts a little bit, they're going to be out of focus. And at an f2, I feel pretty comfortable that he's going to stay in focus. And even if he shifts a little bit, I'm going to be okay. And so now that we have our aperture set, the next one that we need to look at is my shutter speed. And I'm not a believer of the shutter rule. I don't follow the shutter rule. To me, shutter speed is a pure creative tool, and I can manipulate my shutter to really do some incredible things. And so I don't limit myself by following a shutter rule. That's for another video, and we can talk about that another time. If we look at the shot of the lobby, we can see that they had some overhead lighting that's spilling on those walls. What we don't see on this picture is there's actually a big lighting fixture overhead. And that one I was able to turn off. But those, the ones on the side, I did not have control of them. And so we needed to leave those on. And I use my shutter in that case to make sure that they don't flicker. And the best way to do that is you turn your false color on your monitor. If you have false color, it's really helpful. And then you can see much easier the flickering of those lights on the false color. And then I adjust my shutter until the flicker is gone. And typically that's a 60th of a second, since that's how many hertz our electrical grid is here in the US. And so now we know that we have our camera setting at an f2 and our shutter speed is 1/60th. And we have some level of ND and we have an EI of 400. And so now what I'm going to do now that I have my creative settings done, I can now adjust my ND filter until I see on my false color that the sky is fairly high as far as the IRE levels, but it's not peaking. So here this yellow is the 85 to 93 IRE. Now, this is looking at false color on the Rec. 709. So we know that pure white or peaking would be at 100 IRE. And here I adjust my ND until I get into the yellow, but not into the orange, which would be 100 IRE. So we know that at these levels, there's still texture, there's still detail into the clouds of that sky. And what we ended up with, let me get rid of these, is an ND of 5. So now that we have our exposure done for the windows, we can lock in those settings. We will not adjust them anymore unless, again, something happened outside and I want to remove a little bit of ND or add some ND depending on what the cloud coverage is doing outside. But my shutter speed, my f-stop is not going to change. We're going to just leave it locked in. And now it's all about adding artificial lighting to my subject and to the rest of the room to get to the levels that I want. And when we talk about lighting, what we're trying to do obviously is we want to expose to the right level, right? We need to make sure that our subject is bright enough. Like right now, without a light, he would be like a silhouette. He would be completely black. And so we want to make sure that we use lighting to raise the level until he's exposed properly. That's the first goal of the lighting. The other goal of lighting is to create contrast. And that's contrast on his face, contrast in the room, separation between the midtones and the shadows, so that we can create something that visually is appealing, that's not flat and it's not all the same level. And also we can manipulate in post-production. Like if I want to raise his shadows a little bit, I can. If I want to make his shadow side, his fill side a little darker, I can do that. And so the separation is important. So those are the two goals of lighting. So once I have the key light in place, all I'm going to do is raise the intensity of that light until I have the right exposure on his key side. And because I monitor the Rec. 709 through my external monitor, the false color, then I want a little bit of 70 IRE. So, skin tone should be about 60 IRE, maybe 55. But for me, I go 70 as the very bright spot of their face. The issue that we had once we set our key light is that it showed up in the window. And obviously we can't leave it like that. But we didn't have a way of maintaining the levels on his face and remove the reflection in the window. Like we didn't have stand to go high enough. And then even if we did, we would have lost some intensity as far as the level. And I don't believe we would have had enough as far as exposing his face. And so we know that our light needs to stay there. And now we have to deal with this reflection. All you need to do is, that's what this stand is here for. All we're going to do is we're actually going to hang a black pop-up. So you can see the reflection here, and then we're going to move the pop-up, the black pop-up, and now it's gone. If you look closely here, you can see that we've placed a little LED panel that's pointing towards that corner. And I can raise those levels until I have the levels that I want in here. What I don't want is, I don't want this corner and this corner to be the same level. I want this to be a little darker, but not too much. And so that's what this panel is here for. I can simply raise the level on my phone. I can control that light with my phone while I'm looking at my false color, or even just at the monitor, and raise those levels until I feel like that area is what I want. The last thing is using a backlight, or in this case, an edge light. That's something that I just purchased, and I'm really enjoying creating those edge lights. And that's the edge that you see here. That's all those levels that you see here comes from the tube. Traditionally, I probably would have put a backlight on top, like overhead, and shine some levels on both shoulders and a little bit on top of his head to create that separation. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just creatively right now, for me, I really like creating just this edge here and make it a little bit harsher as well. And it's an interesting balance because you can see now that it's also bleeding a little bit on his face. And I love it. I think it's great. You just got to be careful because the placement has to be pretty precise, because if you put that tube too much to the front, you're going to fill all that shadow that he has on this side. It's going to become flat with the key light. And if you put it too far behind, then you're not going to get that edge. So the placement of that tube light is critical. And you can see the tube here. It works really well, and I'm pretty happy with it. I think this is our third or fourth job with it, and it's been a really, really fun tool to play with, and pretty flexible. So this is our entire setup. We have our key light right here. We have a fill for the room. We have an edge, and then the last thing that we have is our pop-up to remove the reflection in the window. So this is a very typical approach to all of my jobs, and it's really all about being intentional about using camera settings to achieve a specific look versus being tied down to an exposure, and using those tools to achieve a look versus to just expose. And then we can expose using the ND filter and artificial lighting to raise the levels that we need. Hopefully that was helpful. Let me know in the comments how you approach or how you would approach a situation like this. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel to receive all the alerts on new videos that I release every single week. You can also visit my website at cinematic.com for all my online courses. Thanks again, and happy filming.